Hello everyone and welcome. Yes, my name is Arafire and welcome to another episode of My Top 5, where today I'm going to go back to the Generation 1 cartoon, which we always seem to do. This is no exception because this is a video I've wanted to do for a while. I want to do my top 5 characters from each of the seasons of the Generation 1 cartoon. Not so much the toys, not so much the voice actors behind them, but I want to talk about the characters that they were presented to us in the show. So I'm starting off with season 1, and I'm just going to talk about the characters who were presented to us in that season. Now, for the sake of people asking the question as to where season 1 actually ends, because for a lot of people, and at least in my first impressions, it ends with Heavy Metal War, and that really does feel like the natural end of the first season. But according to Wikipedia, it runs up to the 16th episode, which is a plague of Insecticons. And so for the sake of this video, I'll run it from the 3-part pilot up to episode 16. Not that it will make too much difference to my top 5. I will say, going to the other videos going forward, whoever I list in this video today will not be eligible to be used in the other episodes for the other seasons going forward. Can't repeat the same character twice, basically. Okay, let's get on with it, shall we?
Arafire's Top 5.
Quick shout out to Vaults of Icon again for using that new intro. I've mentioned it before, but I do really like it. Thank you very much, Vaults, for your help with that one. Number 5, Soundwave. Okay, going to be a bit of an obvious list and a very obvious candidate. Soundwave has always been cool, and even though he was very autonomous, very robotic, how he presented to us, he was early reconnaissance, transforming into a lamppost of all things, which has been quite iconic ever since, launching cassettes out of his center chest piece and always being one of the trusted lieutenants, ever loyal, ever dependable for Megatron. But he was a very unique character with his voice, unique with his cassettes. We don't see Blaster until season 2, so the fact he looked quite cool, he turned into a little cassette tape player. That was pretty cool. A nice little Walkman, very much of its time. And his iconic voice, which was reprised in the Bumblebee film as well, with that wonderful 3-minute opening scene. Character is very synonymous with Transformers, and the early introduction to him in season 1 of the Generation 1 cartoon was quite cool, very welcome. He was obviously well portrayed in other media, such as the Marvel Comics, where he had much more of a one-on-one role alongside Optimus Prime. And it would always seem in the Generation 1 cartoon that whenever Megatron transformed into his gun mode, it would be Soundwave the one who was holding him and firing him. A bit more of a trusted in his safe hands, and it's a very memorable character who's carried on to this day and is still very beloved in the Transformers universe. Number 4, Jazz. Jazz was a cool character back then, and he's still a cool character now. You know my love for Scatman Crothers voicing Jazz and really giving that too cool for school, cool cat vibe that really came across. He looked cool with his visor, the fact he turned into a beautiful Porsche with lovely racing livery on it as well. And I'll always like the fact that in season 1, him and Ratchet were the co-leaders, the co-commanders that would take over at times, or at least be leading scout parties. They were the trusted lieutenants. Much like Soundwave to Megatron, Jazz and Prowl were for Optimus. He's still cool when I look at him in other forms of media, and how his comics and even other toys that have been generated still capture that Generation 1 cartoon vibe. He was always hip. Even in the recent additions in Skybound, you see he's got that same kind of personality that exuberated how Scatman brought him across in the G1 cartoon. He's a favourite character for most, and his toy was long used into Generation 2 as well, so it's really nice to see the character still having a nice place in our hearts in Transformers, and he's such a cool character. Thanks very much to Scatman. Number 3, Grimlock. I always forget that Grimlocks and the Dinobots were introduced in season 1, but how could they not be? And albeit they were introduced in 2 different stages, but the leader of the Dinobots, the only one who could really stand toe-to-toe with Optimus other than Megatron, he was certainly standing tall. And I always like the fact that at the end, Grimlock, in his primitive mind, had respect for Optimus. And there was always this Dinobot first, Autobot second, which still exists till this day. But Grimlock, the Dinobots as general, is such a good little unit, such a good faction, and it really felt like a bit of a game changer when the Autobots got them, because they were always one step behind in the Combiner Wars race. So the fact that they said, we need some big muscle, and they brought in the Dinobots, and they had these kind of brutes that were uncontrollable even by the Autobot standards. Whilst it did level the playing field, you never felt that the Autobots had full control, and Grimlock epitomised that. He knew his worth, he knew his team's worth. And then it comes into, well, how smart was Grimlock? In a G1 cartoon, there was a bit of a dumb genius vibe going throughout. But then again, in the comics, and certainly in the G1 comics, in Marvel Comics, there was a much more composed leadership, not that slow-speaking voice reprised by Greg Berger, which still was lovable. You felt that in the comics he was always deemed to be smarter and more savvy. But in terms of the G1 cartoon, I love it when he just runs up to Megatron in the airport and just decides to bite onto his hip and throw him around. He was just not afraid of anyone. He is the Dinobot might. He is that leader personified that easily could have been the leader of the Autobots and was in other parts of the fandom. But in terms of the cartoon, he was always great to see on screen, no matter which mode he reprised in. He's such a beloved character to this day. Number 2, Starscream. Starscream was always a favourite of mine, voiced by the late great Chris Latta, who really gave that whining, high-pitched voice that is again still synonymous to this day, much like Scatman was for Jazz. You can get that snivellingness come through, but there was always a sense of cheering on for him. Now, I've used this term before that people disagree with, saying that do I class Starscream as an anti-hero? I think there is elements of it. I think there are instances in a G1 cartoon that he's so fed up with the likes of Shockwave and Soundwave getting praised ahead of him and how he feels he's destined for more. You can't help but cheer on for him. You can't help but want him to overthrow Megatron. He continuously feels that he's being suppressed by Megatron and his other comrades, and he's always trying to start a mutiny, start a revolution, create a Splinter Cell movement against the Decepticons, and it doesn't get played on enough on the Autobot side, that how they probably could have just stayed back and just let the Decepticons eat themselves, particularly in the early episode when they didn't have much to talk about. They didn't have much in way of a base or Energon. That would be a great time to consider for fractions and fragments. But Starscream was a character. He knew his worth. He was fast. He was arguably still the fastest of his time. And even when it came to fighting the likes of Devastator, he knew he could outrun him. He knew he was destined for more. And it even came to the 1986 movie that he would put himself forward for leader. But in terms of introduction, you couldn't help but cheer on for him. You felt that there was a snivelling, conniving underdog. You could never trust him, but you always wanted him to succeed. And again, that character has been brought to life by the voice actor, by Chris Latta, and is one reason why he's still one of my favourite characters to this day. And number 1, Optimus Prime. Yeah, a very predictable list, but cast your mind back if you're starting in 1984 and this is what you see. That beloved voice of Peter Cullen, but the image of a giant red truck being the heroic leader, a yellow Energon axe, always the biggest, always the one to save the day. And really in the season 1 cartoon there wasn't too many others of grand stature, maybe save Grimlock. So you were always drawn to Prime. There was no Ultra Magnus, there was Skyfire, eventually Jetfire, and there was Omega Supreme, but you never really got something to draw your eyes to quite as much as Prime. And Optimus was presented as a hero, as the one we all bought into. I was no exception. He was the hero, and he still is the hero to this day. He gives that grandstand appearance. And when it's presented like that, you can't help but fall in love with it. He is the poster child of Transformers to this day. Even in other forms of fandom, you just see something that vaguely looks like a red truck in a robot and you think, yeah, it's Optimus. If it's not trying to be Transformers, you know what it's trying to symbolise. He is the symbol of himself. And when you're a child growing up looking at this, you can't help but love that. You can't help but be drawn into just how great a character this was. All the right values for its time. And yes, it was a little bit machiney, it was a little bit lacking of humour and lacking of a human nature, but to be the iconic inspirational leader, it ticked that box straight away. It gave that big fighting sensation that no matter what, he will lead his troops into battle. He would never ask anyone else to do something he wasn't prepared to do himself. The fact he would always lead the charge would say how much of a heroic leader he was presented to us as, and certainly how it was received by fans. You'll notice that Megatron's missing from the list. Megatron is a very important character, no question, but in terms of how it's presented, Optimus was the hero, Megatron was forever the villain, and Megatron would retreat a lot in the G1 cartoon, but that's by the by. Optimus was always the one presented to be the saviour of the day, the Captain America, the one who will never falter, and that is why he is so recognisable. He is the Hulk Hogan, if you like, of the Transformer universe, recognisable to all. He is that inspiration, and that is why he's so popular and will forever be. Thanks very much so to Peter Cullen. And there we go, that is my top 5 Transformer characters from the first season of the G1 cartoon. What are yours? Do leave a comment below of your top 5 characters, again for season 1. If it's a character that comes up again in season 2, fine, you can choose whatever. But that's what I've chosen for this list. I've gone with the characters who just appeared in season 1. Thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you on the next one.